Margaret Thompson had been driving the yellow school bus for Riverside Elementary for over 15 years. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, she would start her route through the quiet neighborhoods, picking up children who would fill her bus with chatter, laughter, and the occasional argument over who got to sit where. She knew every child by name, every stop by heart, and every parent who waited nervously at the curb during the first week of school. But there was one child who had caught Margaret's attention in a way that made her heart heavy. 7-year-old Keisha Williams would board the bus at the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue, always alone, always carrying a worn backpack that seemed too big for her small frame. What troubled Margaret most was that every single day, without fail, Keisha would climb those 3 steps onto the bus with tears streaming down her dark cheeks. At first, Margaret thought it might be typical separation anxiety. Many children cried during their first few weeks of school, missing their parents and the comfort of home. She had seen it countless times before. She would offer Keisha a gentle smile and a soft, "Good morning, sweetheart," hoping to provide some comfort. But as weeks turned into months, the tears never stopped. If anything, they seemed to get worse. Keisha would always choose the same seat, 3rd row from the back on the left side, right behind where Tommy Martinez usually sat. She would press herself against the window, her small body curled up as she silently wept. Margaret could see her in the large rearview mirror, and it broke her heart every time. The other children seemed oblivious to Keisha's distress, caught up in their own conversations and games. Margaret tried everything she could think of to help. She would ask Keisha gentle questions about her day, compliment her pretty braids, or tell funny stories about her own grandchildren. Sometimes she would play Keisha's favorite songs on the radio, having noticed that the little girl would stop crying momentarily when certain melodies played. But nothing seemed to provide lasting comfort. The afternoon rides were even worse. While other children would board the bus chattering excitedly about their day, sharing stories about playground adventures, art projects, or new friendships, Keisha would climb on with red, swollen eyes and take her usual seat. She never spoke to anyone, never participated in the other children's games, and never seemed to have any friends to sit with. Margaret began to notice other troubling details. Keisha's clothes, while clean, were often too small or showed signs of heavy wear. Her shoes had holes that she tried to hide by walking carefully. Some days she didn't have a lunch, and Margaret started keeping extra snacks in her lunchbox, just for Keisha. The little girl would accept them gratefully, but silently. What worried Margaret most was the fear she saw in Keisha's eyes. It wasn't just sadness or homesickness. It was something deeper, something that made Margaret's stomach turn with concern. She had raised 4 children of her own and had grandchildren Keisha's age, so she knew the difference between normal childhood troubles and something more serious. Margaret decided to pay closer attention to Keisha's stop. The house at the corner of Maple and 3rd was a small 2-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the small front yard was overgrown with weeds, and several windows were covered with cardboard instead of glass. No parent ever came out to greet Keisha when she got off the bus, unlike most of the other stops where mothers or fathers would wave from doorways or porches. Instead, Keisha would walk slowly up the cracked sidewalk, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Margaret would watch until the little girl disappeared through the front door, always feeling like she should do something more, but not knowing what that something could be. One particularly cold November morning, Margaret arrived at Keisha's stop to find the little girl sitting on the curb, shivering in a thin jacket that provided little protection against the harsh wind. Her tears had frozen on her cheeks and her lips were blue from the cold. Margaret immediately opened the bus door and called out to her. "Honey, how long have you been sitting out here?" Margaret asked, her voice full of concern. Keisha looked up with those big, sad eyes and whispered, "I don't know, Miss Margaret. A long time, I think." Margaret helped Keisha onto the bus, and wrapped her in the emergency blanket she kept behind her seat. As she drove toward the school, she made a decision. She was going to talk to Mrs. Patterson, the school counselor, about Keisha. Something wasn't right at home, and this little girl needed help. During her lunch break that day, Margaret found Mrs. Patterson in her office. Sarah Patterson was a kind woman in her 40s who had dedicated her career to helping children navigate their problems. Margaret had worked with her many times over the years when students were dealing with difficult situations at home or school. "I'm worried about one of my riders," Margaret began, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Keisha Williams. Have you noticed anything unusual about her?" Sarah's expression immediately grew serious. "Yes, actually. Several of her teachers have mentioned concerns. She's extremely withdrawn, rarely speaks in class, and her academic performance is suffering. We've tried to contact her guardian multiple times, but the phone number on file is disconnected, and when we've sent letters home, we never receive responses." "Guardian?" Margaret asked. "I thought she lived with her parents. According to our records, she lives with her aunt, Carmen Williams. Both parents are listed as deceased. There's very little information in her file, and what we do have seems incomplete." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. No wonder the poor child was so sad. She was dealing with loss that most adults would struggle to handle, and she was doing it all alone. "What can we do?" Margaret asked. "I've been trying to arrange a home visit, but I need to be careful. We have to follow proper protocols. However, if you continue to observe anything concerning during your routes, please let me know immediately. Sometimes bus drivers see things that others miss." Margaret promised to keep watching, but she felt frustrated by how slowly the system seemed to move when a child was clearly suffering. That afternoon, she paid extra attention as she dropped Keisha off at her stop. The little girl walked even more slowly than usual, and Margaret noticed her looking back at the bus several times, as if she didn't want to go home. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice a pattern. On Mondays, Keisha's tears seemed worse, as if something particularly difficult happened over the weekends. By Friday afternoons, there was a sense of dread in the child's posture that made Margaret's heart ache. Margaret started arriving at Keisha's stop a few minutes early each morning, just to make sure the little girl wasn't sitting outside in the cold again. She also began staying a bit longer after dropping her off, watching to make sure she got inside safely. It was during one of these extended observations that Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through a gap in the cardboard covering one of the downstairs windows, Margaret saw shadows moving in ways that didn't seem right. She couldn't make out details, but something about the movement made her feel uneasy. She sat in her bus for several more minutes, watching and listening, but everything went quiet after Keisha entered the house. The next morning, Margaret noticed fresh bruises on Keisha's arms. When she gently asked about them, Keisha quickly pulled down her sleeves and mumbled something about falling down the stairs. But Margaret had been around children long enough to know the difference between accidental injuries and something more sinister. That evening, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Keisha's frightened eyes, her daily tears, and those suspicious bruises. She thought about her own grandchildren, safe and loved in their homes, and couldn't bear the thought of any child suffering in silence. Margaret arrived at work the next morning with a heavy heart and a determination to help Keisha somehow. As she performed her usual pre-trip inspection of the bus, checking mirrors, lights, and emergency exits, her mind kept wandering to the little girl who would soon board with tears in her eyes. When she pulled up to Keisha's stop, something was different. The little girl wasn't waiting on the corner as usual. Margaret waited for several minutes, honking her horn gently to signal her arrival, but no one appeared. She was about to drive on when she saw Keisha stumbling out of the house, moving differently than usual. As Keisha approached the bus, Margaret could see that her left arm was cradled against her body, and she was walking with a slight limp. When she climbed the steps, Margaret noticed that her face was puffy on one side, and there was a cut on her lower lip that looked fresh. "Oh, honey, what happened to you?" Margaret asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Keisha looked up with eyes that seemed older than her 7 years. "I fell down the stairs again, Miss Margaret. I'm real clumsy." But Margaret wasn't buying it. She had seen enough in her years of driving school children to recognize signs of abuse. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove toward the school, her mind racing with what she should do. During her break, Margaret immediately went to find Mrs. Patterson. The counselor's face grew pale as Margaret described Keisha's condition that morning. "We need to contact Child Protective Services," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "This can't wait any longer." While Sarah made the necessary calls, Margaret couldn't concentrate on her afternoon route. She kept thinking about Keisha sitting in a classroom, probably in pain, probably scared about going home. When it came time for the afternoon pickup, Margaret was dreading what she might see. Keisha boarded the bus that afternoon, moving even more carefully than she had that morning. She took her usual seat and immediately curled up against the window. Margaret watched her in the rearview mirror and noticed something she hadn't seen before. Keisha was whispering something, her lips moving silently, as if she was talking to herself or maybe praying. When they reached Keisha's stop, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply opening the door and waiting for Keisha to get off, she turned in her seat and spoke directly to her. "Keisha, sweetheart, can you come up here and talk to Miss Margaret for a minute?" The little girl looked surprised, but obediently made her way to the front of the bus. Up close, Margaret could see the full extent of the damage. The bruises were worse than she had initially thought, and there were finger-shaped marks on Keisha's upper arms that were clearly visible. "Honey, I want you to know that you can tell me anything, okay? Sometimes grown-ups hurt children, and that's never okay. If someone is hurting you, it's not your fault, and there are people who want to help you." Keisha's eyes filled with fresh tears. And for a moment, Margaret thought she might finally open up. But then the little girl's face closed off again and she shook her head. "Nobody's hurting me, Miss Margaret. I just fall down a lot. Aunt Carmen says I need to be more careful." Margaret's heart broke at the rehearsed response. She gently squeezed Keisha's hand and said, "Okay, baby. But remember what I said. You can always talk to me." As Keisha got off the bus and walked toward her house, Margaret noticed something that made her stomach clench with worry. A man was standing in the doorway watching them. Even from a distance, Margaret could sense his anger. He was tall and muscular, with a beer bottle in his hand, and the way he stood suggested barely controlled rage. Margaret watched as Keisha approached the house, her steps getting slower with each passing moment. When the little girl reached the door, the man grabbed her roughly by the shoulder and pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with such force that Margaret jumped in her seat. That evening, Margaret couldn't eat dinner. She kept thinking about Keisha trapped in that house with that angry man. She called Mrs. Patterson at home, something she rarely did, but this felt like an emergency. "I filed the report with CPS today," Sarah told her. "They said they'll investigate, but it could take several days before they can do a home visit. In the meantime, we need to continue monitoring the situation." Several days felt like an eternity when a child was in danger. Margaret lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Keisha was safe or if she was lying in her bed, scared and hurt. The next few days were a nightmare. Keisha continued to board the bus with new injuries, each one more concerning than the last. Margaret started taking photos with her phone, documenting what she was seeing. Mrs. Patterson assured her that CPS was working on the case, but the wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly. On Friday afternoon, something different happened. As Keisha was getting off the bus, she dropped something. Margaret saw it fall but didn't immediately realize what it was. After Keisha had gone inside and Margaret was about to drive away, she decided to check what had fallen. She parked the bus and walked to where Keisha had stepped off. There, lying on the sidewalk, was a small piece of paper, folded several times. Margaret picked it up and unfolded it. In a child's careful handwriting, she read words that made her blood run cold. "Help me. He hurts me when Aunt Carmen goes to work. I'm scared he's going to kill me. Please don't let him know I told." Margaret's hands shook as she read the note again. This was the evidence everyone needed, but more importantly, this was a desperate cry for help from a terrified child. She immediately called Mrs. Patterson, reading the note over the phone. "Bring that note straight to the school," Sarah instructed. "I'm calling CPS right now. This changes everything." Margaret drove back to the school as fast as she safely could. By the time she arrived, Mrs. Patterson had already contacted the authorities, and a social worker was on her way to meet them. When Linda Rodriguez from Child Protective Services arrived, she examined the note carefully and listened to Margaret's account of everything she had observed over the past months. Linda's expression grew more serious with each detail. "We'll need to remove Keisha from the home immediately," Linda said. "This note, combined with the documented injuries and your observations, gives us grounds for emergency removal. We'll coordinate with the police to ensure everyone's safety." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that Keisha would finally be safe, but anxiety about what the next few hours would bring. Linda explained that they would need to wait until the next school day to remove Keisha, as it would be safer to take her from school rather than attempting to get her from the house. That weekend was the longest of Margaret's life. She couldn't stop thinking about Keisha, spending another weekend in that house of horrors, not knowing that help was finally coming. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. Margaret arrived at Keisha's stop with her heart pounding, praying that the little girl would be there and that she would be okay enough to make it through one more day. When Keisha appeared at the door of the house, Margaret gasped. The little girl's face was so swollen that one eye was completely shut. She was holding her ribs as she walked, and she was moving like every step caused her pain. As Keisha climbed onto the bus, Margaret had to fight back tears of rage and sorrow. "Good morning, sweet girl," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Keisha tried to smile but winced in pain. "Morning, Miss Margaret." Margaret drove toward the school, knowing that this would be the last time she would pick up Keisha from that terrible place. The social workers would be waiting at the school, ready to take Keisha somewhere safe. As they drove through the familiar neighborhoods, Margaret said a silent prayer of gratitude that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. When Margaret pulled up to Riverside Elementary that Monday morning, she saw several unfamiliar cars in the parking lot. Her heart raced as she realized that the Child Protective Services team was already there, waiting to help Keisha. As the other children filed off the bus, chattering about their weekend activities, Margaret gently asked Keisha to wait for a moment. "Sweetheart, Mrs. Patterson wants to see you in her office this morning. I'm going to walk with you, okay?" Keisha nodded slowly, though Margaret could see confusion and worry in her one good eye. As they walked through the school hallways, Margaret kept her hand gently on Keisha's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. In Mrs. Patterson's office, Linda Rodriguez was waiting with another social worker and a child advocate. They had prepared carefully for this moment, knowing that removing a child from their home, even an abusive one, could be traumatic. "Hi, Keisha," Linda said softly, kneeling down to the little girl's level. "My name is Linda, and I work for an organization that helps keep children safe. We know that things haven't been good at home, and we're here to help you." Keisha looked around the room at all the adult faces, then back at Margaret. "Am I in trouble, Miss Margaret? Did I do something wrong?" Margaret's heart nearly broke at the question. She knelt down beside Linda and took Keisha's small hands in hers. "Oh, honey, no. You're not in trouble at all. These nice people are here because they want to help you. Remember what I told you about how grown-ups should never hurt children? Well, these people make sure that children are safe and protected." Over the next hour, Linda and her team spoke gently with Keisha, explaining that they knew she had been hurt at home and that it wasn't her fault. They told her about foster families who specialized in caring for children who needed a safe place to stay. Throughout the conversation, Keisha kept looking to Margaret for reassurance, and Margaret stayed close, holding her hand when she seemed scared. The medical examination that followed confirmed what everyone already suspected. Keisha had multiple injuries in various stages of healing, indicating that the abuse had been going on for a long time. The doctor who examined her was gentle and kind, explaining everything she was doing and praising Keisha for being brave. While Keisha was being examined, Linda spoke with Margaret and Mrs. Patterson about what would happen next. "We've obtained an emergency removal order," Linda explained. "Keisha will be placed in a therapeutic foster home with a family that specializes in helping children who have experienced trauma. They'll make sure she gets the counseling and medical care she needs." "What about her aunt?" Margaret asked. "Was she part of this?" Linda's expression grew sad. "From what we've been able to piece together, Carmen Williams works 2 jobs to support herself and Keisha. The abuse was being perpetrated by her boyfriend, Marcus, who moved in about 6 months ago. We believe Carmen was also a victim and may not have known the full extent of what was happening when she wasn't home." Margaret thought about all those times she had seen Keisha's tears and wondered if the little girl had been suffering in silence, too afraid to tell anyone what was happening. When Keisha returned from her medical examination, she was wearing new clothes provided by the social services team. She looked small and vulnerable, but there was something different in her posture. For the first time in months, she wasn't crying. Linda knelt down beside Keisha again. "Keisha, you're going to come with us now to meet Mary and David Chen. They're a very nice family who take care of children who need a safe place to stay. They have a big dog named Buddy and a cat named Whiskers, and they're excited to meet you." "Will I still ride Miss Margaret's bus to school?" Keisha asked, looking worried. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Well, honey, you might go to a different school that's closer to your new home, but I want you to know that I will never forget you, and I'm so proud of you for being brave enough to ask for help." Keisha surprised everyone by stepping forward and hugging Margaret tightly. "Thank you for being nice to me, Miss Margaret. Thank you for keeping crackers for when I was hungry." Margaret hugged her back, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Remember that you deserve to be treated with kindness and love, always." As the social workers prepared to leave with Keisha, Linda handed Margaret a business card. "We'll need you to testify in court about what you observed. Your testimony will be crucial in making sure Keisha stays safe and that Marcus is held accountable for what he did." Margaret nodded without hesitation. "I'll do whatever is needed to protect that little girl." 3 weeks later, Margaret received a call from Linda Rodriguez. "I thought you'd want to know that Keisha is doing really well with the Chen family. She's still in counseling, of course, but she started smiling again. She asked me to tell you that she learned to ride a bicycle." Margaret smiled through her tears. "That's wonderful. How are the legal proceedings going?" "Marcus was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse. Carmen is cooperating fully with the investigation. She's getting counseling too and has expressed deep regret for not recognizing the signs sooner. She was working so many hours just to make ends meet that she wasn't home enough to see what was really happening." "Will Keisha be able to stay with the Chen family?" "That's still being determined. Carmen wants to regain custody, but she'll need to complete parenting classes and counseling first. In the meantime, the Chens are providing a stable, loving environment. They've indicated they'd be willing to continue caring for Keisha as long as needed." Margaret felt a sense of peace, knowing that Keisha was finally safe and getting the care she needed. 6 months later, Margaret was driving her usual route when she saw a familiar figure waiting at one of her stops. As she got closer, she realized it was Keisha, but she looked completely different. The little girl was smiling. Her hair was neatly braided with colorful ribbons, and she was wearing clean, well-fitting clothes. Most importantly, there were no tears on her cheeks. "Miss Margaret!" Keisha called out excitedly as she boarded the bus. "I'm back. Mrs. Chen said I could ride your bus again because I'm going to Riverside Elementary again." Margaret was so surprised and happy that she had to pull over for a moment to collect herself. "Oh my goodness, Keisha! Look at you! You look wonderful!" Keisha beamed with pride. "I live with Mrs. Chen and Mr. Chen now. They adopted me. And I have a big sister named Amy, and Buddy the dog sleeps on my bed every night." "That's incredible news," Margaret said, genuinely thrilled. "Are you excited to be back at Riverside?" "Yes." Mrs. Patterson said she can't wait to see me. And guess what? I don't cry anymore, Miss Margaret. Mrs. Chen taught me that when I feel sad, I should use my words to tell someone instead of keeping it inside. As they drove toward the school, Keisha chattered excitedly about her new life. She told Margaret about learning to swim, about helping Mrs. Chen in the garden, about her therapy dog training classes, where she was learning to help other children who had been through scary things like she had. When they arrived at the school, Keisha stood up to get off the bus, then turned back to Margaret. "Miss Margaret, Mrs. Chen says that sometimes angels come in different forms to help us when we need it most. She says you were my angel because you saw that I needed help and you made sure I got it." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. But these were tears of joy and gratitude. "You were always worthy of help and love, Keisha. I'm just glad I was paying attention." "I have something for you," Keisha said, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a hand-drawn picture that showed two figures standing beside a yellow school bus. One was labeled Miss Margaret, and the other was labeled Keisha. Above them, she had written in careful letters, "Thank you for saving me." Margaret accepted the drawing with shaking hands. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received, sweetheart." As Keisha skipped toward the school building, Margaret sat in her bus for a few minutes, looking at the drawing and thinking about the journey they had all been on. She thought about how many children rode her bus every day and how important it was to really see them, to notice when something wasn't right. That afternoon, when Margaret picked up Keisha for the ride home, the little girl chose a seat near the front instead of hiding in the back. She talked with other children, laughed at their jokes, and seemed genuinely happy. When they reached Keisha's new stop in a quiet suburban neighborhood, Margaret watched as a smiling Asian woman came out to greet them. "You must be Margaret," the woman said, approaching the bus. "I'm Susan Chen. I can't thank you enough for what you did for our daughter." Margaret stepped off the bus to shake Susan's hand. "She's not the same little girl anymore. You've given her such a wonderful gift." "Actually," Susan said, "I think we've all given each other wonderful gifts. Keisha has brought so much joy to our family. And you gave her the gift of hope when she needed it most." As Margaret drove away that day, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She had been driving school buses for 15 years, thinking she was just providing transportation for children. But now she understood that her job was much more important than that. She was often the first adult to see these children each day and the last to see them before they went home. She was in a unique position to notice when a child needed help. From that day forward, Margaret approached her job with renewed purpose. She made it her mission to really see each child who boarded her bus, to notice changes in behavior or appearance, and to be a source of safety and comfort for any child who needed it. Keisha continued to ride Margaret's bus throughout elementary school, and their bond remained strong. Years later, when Keisha graduated high school as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to study social work in college, Margaret was there in the audience, cheering louder than anyone. In her graduation speech, Keisha talked about how one person's compassion and attention had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She spoke about her plans to work in child protection services, inspired by the people who had saved her and determined to be that lifeline for other children in need. Margaret realized that day that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply pay attention, care enough to act when something isn't right, and trust that our small actions can have enormous impacts on the lives of others. Keisha's story had begun with tears and fear, but because people chose to see her, to care about her, and to act on her behalf, it had become a story of hope, healing, and the transformative power of human compassion.